A black Labrador is sniffing at a patch of snow behind the cul-de-sac in Missoula, Montana, and its owner is standing there in a North Face parka, waiting for it to finish. February 11th, 2024. Around 4 in the afternoon, wind out of the Bitterroots doing what wind does in the Bitterroots. The dog won't leave the spot. It keeps scratching at the ground, circling, scratching again. The owner yanks the leash, and nothing happens. The dog has found something. Then the man in the parka notices the snow is melting in a perfect circle about 3 feet wide. Just that circle. The rest of the yard is frozen hard enough to ring if you kicked it. He bends down and puts his bare hand flat against the snow, right at the edge of the melt. The ground under his palm is warm, not the damp chill of earth under snow, but actually warm, like a heating vent had been pumping under the grass for weeks. His breath clouds up, and he says one word out loud to nobody. Huh. That man, his name was Dale Brennan, and he ran the HOA for Larchmont Drive, had been trying to get Ingrid Vahanian evicted from the empty lot at the end of the street for 9 months. He'd mocked her, filed 3 complaints, called her a hazard, told his wife over dinner that the old woman with the weird eyes was going to freeze in her hole in the ground and make the neighborhood look bad. Dale Brennan was standing on top of her living room. He just didn't know it yet. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something. Because if you don't, the rest of what happened on Larchmont Drive that winter is going to sound like a fairy tale. It isn't. It's physics. Specifically, it's a physics principle that the U.S. Department of Energy has been publishing pamphlets about since 1978, and almost nobody reads. 6 feet below the surface of the ground in Missoula, Montana, the temperature is 52 degrees Fahrenheit. That's true in January and in July, during a blizzard and during a heat wave. The dirt down there does not care what the sky is doing. That's the whole secret. That's the thing Dale Brennan did not know when he bent down and put his hand on warm snow in the middle of a cul-de-sac in February. Ingrid Vahanian knew it. She'd known it since she was 7 years old, and her grandmother in Gyumri explained to her, in a mix of Armenian and broken English, why the root cellar stayed cold enough to keep the cheese from spoiling in August and warm enough in January that the pickled cabbage didn't burst the jars. The Earth is a battery, the oldest, biggest, dumbest, most reliable battery on the planet. If you can figure out how to plug yourself into it, you don't really need a furnace. Ingrid figured it out. We'll come back to Dale and his melting snow circle. First, how did a 61-year-old Armenian widow end up digging a hole in the vacant lot on Larchmont Drive in the first place? Her husband, Grigory, died on April 3, 2021. Pancreatic cancer. 14 weeks from the diagnosis to the funeral, they had run a small bakery on the north side of Missoula for 22 years. Lavash, gata, walnut cookies with the little thumbprint of apricot jam in the middle, the kind of place where the regulars knew which stool had the wobbly leg. Gregory managed the books, and Ingrid made the bread. She found out 3 days after the funeral that there were no books. Grigory had stopped paying the small business loan in 2019 when the first round of chemo started, and he hadn't told her. The bakery was collateral. The bank sent a man in a gray coat who was polite and used the word "unfortunately" 6 times in one conversation. The bakery was gone by September. The apartment above the bakery was gone by October, because the apartment had been part of the lease. Her daughter lived in Yerevan and her son lived in Portland with a wife who did not want Ingrid in the guest room. The son offered money. Ingrid did not take money from him because, and this part matters for understanding what she did next, Ingrid Vahanian was, by temperament, by birth, by the hard, particular stubbornness of women who lived through the 1988 Spatak earthquake, as children, a person who solved her own problems. She had $6,100 left when the apartment went. She had a 1997 Ford Ranger, a folding shovel, her grandmother's recipe book, and a notebook she had been keeping since Grigory got sick. 94 pages of handwritten notes on something she'd become quietly obsessed with during the worst weeks of his illness: earth-sheltered housing. She'd read a book from the Missoula Public Library called The Earth-Sheltered Owner-Built Home by Mike Oler, published in 1978, long out of print. She'd read it 4 times. She'd read a 1980s government document called Earth-Sheltered Housing Code, zoning and financing issues that she'd found in a free box at a yard sale. She'd read everything the library had on passive solar, on thermal mass, on the 4-foot rule and the 6-foot rule, and what a frost line is and why it matters. She had done a thing older widows are not supposed to do. She had quietly become an expert. On November 7th, 2021, Ingrid drove her Ranger to a vacant lot on the east end of Larchmont Drive, which had a "For Sale by Owner" sign that had been up since 2017. She called the number. The owner, a man named Dean who'd inherited the lot from his uncle and was tired of paying the property tax on it, offered her the parcel for $4,500 cash. She bought it, legally. With a signed quitclaim deed dated November 12, 2021, Larchmont Drive did not yet know she existed. The first time anyone on the street saw Ingrid Vahanian, she was standing in the middle of the empty lot with the folding shovel in a dark green wool coat that had belonged to her mother. And she was doing nothing, just standing there, looking at the ground. A woman named Carla Mindel was walking her poodle past the lot on the morning of November 14th, and she later told her husband that there was a strange older lady who looked like a witch, standing in the weeds with a half-shaved head and a long silver braid over one shoulder, one eye pale blue and the other green, just staring at the dirt. Carla crossed the street. Ingrid was not doing nothing, though. Ingrid was reading the lot the way a farmer reads a field. She was looking at which direction the slope ran, south-southwest, a gentle grade of about 4 degrees. She was looking at where the snow had piled against the north fence in the last storm, which told her the prevailing wind. She was looking at the 2 big ponderosa pines in the corner, whose shadows would tell her the sun's low-angle winter path. She was looking at a small rusted rebar stake that a surveyor had driven in 2008 to mark a corner. Every detail was information. She did this for 3 days. Just stood in the lot, walked the perimeter, took notes in the notebook. On the 4th day, she started to dig. This is the part where Larchmont Drive began to pay attention, because you cannot dig a hole in a suburban neighborhood without becoming the main topic of conversation within 48 hours. Her plan, the plan nobody asked her about and that she did not explain to anybody, was an Oler-style earth-sheltered dugout with a modification she'd designed herself for Missoula winters. 14 feet long, 9 feet wide, sunk into the south-facing slope so that 3 walls were underground, and the 4th wall, the south wall, was a glass and timber face that caught the low winter sun. The roof would be buried under 4 feet of soil, sodded over, a living roof. From the street you'd see nothing, just a small glass door set into a hill, and if you didn't look carefully, you'd think it was a utility shed door cut into an embankment. Total estimated cost, $1,800 in materials. Total estimated heating cost, nothing. She wasn't going to install a heater. She was going to let the dirt do it. She started digging on November 19th, 2021. She was 60 years old at the time. She had a shovel, a pick, and she rented a small excavator for 4 days for $480. She worked from 7 in the morning till the sun went down, which in Missoula in late November is about 4:45 p.m. She ate peanut butter sandwiches and drank instant coffee from a thermos. She slept in the Ranger, which she had parked at the far corner of the lot under a tarp. Dale Brennan drove past on the 2nd day of the excavation, slowed down, rolled down his window, and asked if she had a permit for that. She looked at him and said no. Then she went back to digging. You need to know something about Dale, because he's the second character in this story whether he wants to be or not. Dale was 47. He worked as a regional sales director for a medical supply company. He had moved to Larchmont Drive in 2015 with his wife Kathleen and their 2 kids, and within 6 months he'd gotten himself elected HOA president of a neighborhood that technically didn't have an HOA but sort of voluntarily pretended to. Dale cared about property values. He cared about the landscaping plan. He had once, in 2019, sent a polite but firm letter to a neighbor about a garden gnome that Dale felt was non-conforming. He saw Ingrid Vahanian digging a hole in the vacant lot, and he felt a very specific feeling, the feeling of a man whose sense of order was being threatened by a woman he could not figure out. He went home, called the city, learned that she owned the lot, that Missoula County allows earth-sheltered construction under certain conditions, and that she had filed for a permit on November 8th. 4 days before she closed on the lot, and the permit had been approved on November 16th. 3 days before she broke ground. Ingrid had done her homework. She'd spent the quiet weeks after Grigori died reading the Missoula Municipal Code, the way other people read novels. Dale was furious, but he couldn't stop her. So he did what he was good at. He started telling people about her. By Thanksgiving, the whole street knew that some homeless woman was digging a bunker in the vacant lot. By Christmas, Dale had a nickname for her that he thought was very funny. He called her the Mole. She finished the excavation on December 22nd, 2021. A hole in the ground 14 feet long by 9 feet wide by 7.5 feet deep, with a slanted ramp cut into the south side for the entrance. The temperature at the surface that day was 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the hole, at the bottom, where she stood with her shovel, the temperature was 49. She measured it with a cheap probe thermometer from the hardware store and wrote the number down in the notebook. 49 degrees Fahrenheit. Bottom of pit. Air temp, 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Differential, 38 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the part nobody who hadn't read the books could have predicted. She was standing in canvas pants and a wool sweater in a hole in the frozen Montana dirt, and the air around her was 49 degrees, warmer than most people keep their garage, without a single source of heat. That was her foundation. Now she had to build the thing on top of it. This is where the neighbors really started talking, because between December 22nd and March 14th of 2022, Ingrid Vahanian built the shell of her home out of materials that every single person on Larchmont Drive immediately identified as garbage. She bought 40 railroad ties from a guy out in Lolo for $6 apiece. Used, creosote-soaked, dark as coffee. She stacked them to form the walls, notched at the corners like a log cabin sunk in the ground. She laid 2 layers of 6mm black polyethylene sheeting for the waterproofing. She scavenged uninsulated concrete blocks from a demolition site, where a guy named Theo let her take them for free if she loaded them herself. She pulled 14 reclaimed Douglas fir beams from a barn that came down near Hamilton. She bought an old industrial steel door from a salvage yard for $45 and knocked the rust off it herself with a wire wheel on a borrowed drill. And this is the part that made Dale Brennan actually stop his car in the middle of the street and stare. A single enormous south-facing window frame, which she had somehow obtained from a teardown of an old greenhouse outside Arley. 8 feet wide, 6 feet tall, double-paned. She installed that window in early February, in 13-degree weather, alone, using a system of ropes and 2 cinder blocks as a counterweight. Because she did not own a crane and had no friends in Missoula willing to lift glass for a woman they didn't know. The neighbors who watched from their windows that day, holding their morning coffee, said later that it looked like she was going to die out there. Nobody offered to help. She got the window in at 4:12 p.m. on February 8th, and she wrote the time down in the notebook. The roof was the part that made everyone on the street absolutely certain she had lost her mind. She laid the Douglas fir beams across the top of her railroad tie walls. Over the beams, she laid 2x6 planks, tight together. Over the planks, she laid 2 layers of the black polyethylene sheeting, overlapped and sealed with roofing tar. Over that, she laid a drainage mat made of crushed gravel she hauled in the Ranger. 40 trips from a sand and gravel yard in East Missoula. Then she laid 4 feet of dirt on top of her house. Picture that, 4 feet of Montana earth, the full depth of a grown man's waist, sitting on top of the roof you sleep under. Her roof weighed, by her own estimate, about 48 tons. Dale Brennan stood in the street on the afternoon she finished the dirt cap, March 14th, 2022, and he said to a neighbor named Bill Corrigan, loud enough for her to hear, "That thing's going to cave in on her, and we're going to find her in the spring." Bill laughed. A few other neighbors laughed. Ingrid, who was 20 feet away planting buffalo grass seed in the fresh dirt, did not look up. She had calculated the load. The Euler book had a chart. She'd done the math 3 times. Her roof could hold 61 tons before the beams would even flex. She was carrying 48. The safety margin was on paper, in the notebook, and Dale couldn't see the notebook. Dale saw a crazy old woman burying herself. She moved in on April 1st, 2022. The interior, and almost nobody on Larchmont Drive ever saw the interior, So this description is reconstructed from photographs she later gave to a journalist from the Missoulian. Was 9 feet by 14 feet. The south wall was the big double-paned window, angled slightly to catch the winter sun. The floor was a 2-inch slab of concrete she'd poured herself in sections, colored with iron oxide so it looked like rust. On top of the concrete, 3 layers of wool rugs she'd bought at a thrift store for $11 total. The walls inside were the railroad ties, sanded smooth and rubbed with linseed oil, dark, warm-looking, like the inside of a whiskey barrel. A narrow bed ran along the west wall under a shelf of books. A wood-burning stove, a cast-iron jotol she'd bought used for $200, sat in the northwest corner. The stovepipe went straight up to a steel collar she'd cut into the roof. Her grandmother's icon of the Virgin Mary of Gyumri hung on the east wall. On the south wall, right next to the big window, she nailed up a small wooden plaque with the outdoor temperature probe, and on a cord running down into the floor, a second probe that read the temperature of the soil directly underneath her concrete slab, about 2 feet down. That second number, the soil temperature, was the number she watched, because that number was everything. The first real cold snap hit Missoula on November 14, 2022, 8 months after she moved in. Low of -2 Fahrenheit, high of 12, wind chill around -20. On Larchmont Drive that week, 4 of the 17 houses had frozen pipe culls. Dale Brennan's furnace burned through 81 gallons of heating oil in 6 days. The Corrigan's heat pump iced over. Somebody's golden retriever got locked outside for 20 minutes and had to go to the emergency vet for a paw pad check. Ingrid's outdoor probe read -2. Her soil probe read 51. Her indoor air temperature without lighting the wood stove was 63 degrees. She lit the stove anyway, a small fire, 1 armful of wood, because she was making tea. In 20 minutes, the indoor temperature rose to 71. Her heating cost for that week was 0. She had not bought a single stick of firewood. What she was burning was scavenged from a storm-felled pine at the edge of her own lot. That same week, a reporter from the Missoulian named Leah Corby heard about Ingrid from a librarian and drove out to Larchmont to ask for an interview. Ingrid said no, politely. In that particular Armenian way of saying no that sounds like a blessing. Leah stood in the street in her parka, looked at the small hill with the glass door, and asked Ingrid how she heated it. Ingrid said she didn't. Leah asked her to repeat it, and Ingrid said it the same way the second time. She didn't heat it, and then she closed the door. I have to stop here and explain what's actually happening, because otherwise the last part is going to sound like magic. And it isn't. It's the opposite of magic. It's the dullest, most predictable, most well-documented science you've ever heard of, and the reason it sounds magical is that we've spent 100 years building houses that ignore it. A normal house, Dale Brennan's house, for example, is a box of thin walls sitting on top of a concrete slab, exposed on all sides to the air. In winter, that box is at war with the outside. Every degree of warmth you put inside tries immediately to leak out. The wind pulls heat away from the walls. The cold radiates up through the slab. The warm air rises and escapes through every gap around every door and vent and electrical outlet. A furnace running in a modern house is a fire hose pointed into a sieve. An earth-sheltered house is not a box in the air. It's a box inside the dirt. Dirt, at depth, has a temperature that doesn't move. In most of the northern United States, below about 6 feet, the soil temperature year-round is between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. In Missoula, it's about 52. Summer, winter, day, night the same. So picture Ingrid's house. 3 walls and a ceiling pressed against 52-degree dirt. One wall, the south wall, made of glass, facing the winter sun, angled to catch it. When it's -2 outside, her house is not fighting a 116-degree battle. It's fighting maybe a 15-degree battle because the only cold surface in the whole house is the glass. Everything else is pressed against warm dirt, and that glass, when the sun comes up, stops being a weakness. It becomes a solar collector. A south-facing double-paned window in Missoula on a clear January day at noon delivers about 260 watts per square meter of heat. Her window was about 4.5 square meters. For 6 hours of sun, she was getting the equivalent of a small space heater running for free. The concrete slab under her feet absorbed that solar heat during the day. Concrete is a thermal mass. It holds warmth like a stone in a campfire, slow to heat and slow to release. At 2 a.m., it was still 66, radiating heat back into the room all night. She was not, in any meaningful sense, heating her house. She was letting the earth and the sun do it, and occasionally lighting a small fire to boil water. Dale Brennan, who had a 92% efficient furnace running on a smart thermostat, was burning through 348 gallons of heating oil per winter. At the 2023 price in Missoula, that was roughly $1,412. Ingrid's heating bill was zero. And then came the blizzard. February 9th, 2024. The National Weather Service in Missoula issued a warning at 6 a.m. Blizzard conditions expected. Low of -28, sustained winds 35 miles per hour, gusts to 52, snowfall 19 to 24 inches over 36 hours. The street prepared. Dale Brennan moved both his cars into his garage, tested his generator, and texted the HOA group chat with a list of who had functional fireplaces in case of a power outage. The power went out at 9:48 p.m. on February 9th and stayed out for 51 hours. During those 51 hours, the temperature on Larchmont Drive did things that Missoula hadn't seen since 1996. The low, recorded at the airport station, was -31 Fahrenheit. I want you to understand what that means for a normal house. Dale Brennan's furnace, with no electricity, could not run. Electric blowers and electric ignition both dead. His backup generator ran his refrigerator and 2 space heaters in the kids' bedroom. The rest of his house, by hour 14, was 41 degrees. By hour 28, it was 29. His wife and kids were wrapped in every blanket they owned, on one mattress, in the bedroom with the space heaters. His pipes froze on hour 33. He came downstairs to find the kitchen faucet silent and the pipe under the sink already bulging. The Corrigans, 2 doors down, had to evacuate to the Red Cross shelter at the Missoula Fairgrounds on the morning of February 11th. 7 families on Larchmont Drive left their homes during that storm. 2 houses had burst pipes that did $12,000 to $41,000 of damage each. One older couple's pet parakeet died of hypothermia. Ingrid Vahanian, in her hole in the ground, did not know the power was out for 11 hours. She didn't have grid power. She didn't miss what she didn't have. What she had was a propane lantern for light. A 12-volt car battery kept topped up by a small solar panel on the south roof berm that ran a phone charger and an LED bulb and a cheap USB-powered fan to move air. Her Jotel stove that she lit at 10 p.m. On February 9th, when the storm started and fed 2 small pieces of pine every 3 hours, 4 feet of dirt over her head, and 52-degree soil pressed against every surface of her home except the south window, which was covered on the outside by an insulated shutter she'd rigged up for exactly this kind of night. At 3 a.m. on February 10th, with -28 degrees outside, her outdoor probe read -28. Her soil probe, the number she watched, read 51. And her indoor air temperature, with that one tiny stove running on cruise control, was 68. She slept under a wool blanket and a nightgown in the middle of one of the worst cold snaps Missoula had seen in 30 years. On the morning of February 10th, during the storm, she boiled water on the stove and made tea. She wrote in the notebook. She read a book, a second-hand copy of Isabel Allende's La Casa de los Espíritus, in Spanish, which she had been teaching herself slowly for 2 years. Around noon, she noticed something interesting. The snow above her living roof was melting in a circle about 3 feet across, directly above the stovepipe. Her house was slightly warmer than the dirt on the roof, and that small heat was creeping up through the soil and melting a saucer in the snow. She looked at the circle through the window, thought about the physics of it, and wrote a note. She did not know that 19 hours later that same melted circle, which had refrozen and then remelted as her stove cycled, would be noticed by a black Labrador named Milo and his owner. Dale Brennan bent down, put his hand on the warm snow, and stood there for a long time. Then he walked slowly around the small hill at the end of the lot. Last spring, she'd planted buffalo grass on the roof, and in winter, it was just a snow-covered hummock, indistinguishable from a natural rise. Except now, he could see what he had never bothered to see before. There was a chimney pipe coming out of the top, a small steel pipe about 3 inches wide, capped with a rain shield, a thin trickle of clean smoke rising out of it. On the south side of the hill, half buried in snowdrift, was a window. Behind the window, dim in the afternoon gloom, was a warm yellow glow. Dale stood in the snow and looked at the window. He didn't knock. He walked back to his freezing house, where his wife and 2 kids were huddled on a mattress in a room that was now 29 degrees, and he sat down on the stairs in his parka, and he did something he hadn't done in a long time, he thought. 3 days later, when the power finally came back on Larchmont Drive and the plows finally got through, Dale Brennan walked back to the end of the cul-de-sac. He stood in front of the small glass door set into the hill. He knocked. Ingrid opened it with a mug of tea in her hand. Behind her, the room was 69 degrees. The wood stove was cold. It had been out for 2 hours. The room was warm because the sun was coming in through the south window and hitting the concrete floor. Dale said, "Ma'am, I owe you an apology." She looked at him with the 2 different colored eyes and asked him for what specifically. He had planned for a general-purpose apology. He stood there in the snow for about 8 seconds, and then he told her that he was sorry for calling her the mole. She almost smiled, not quite, and told him he could call her Ingrid. He asked her if she'd teach him how she built it. He said his wife had asked him that morning why they were spending $1,400 a winter to heat a house that still went to 29 degrees when the power went out. He said she had asked him, and he had not been able to answer. Ingrid thought about it. She took a sip of tea. Then she told him to come back Saturday and bring a notebook. By the summer of 2024, there were 4 earth-sheltered structures under construction in Greater Missoula. 2 of them were on Larchmont Drive. One belonged to the Corrigans, who had decided after the blizzard that they never wanted to be evacuated to a Red Cross shelter again. The other belonged to a young couple named the Ostertags, who had bought the vacant lot next to Ingrid's because they'd seen what she'd built and done the math. Dale Brennan didn't build one. He sold his house in June 2024 and moved his family to Spokane. Kathleen got a job offer she couldn't turn down. That's the reason he gave. The reason he didn't give, which he told his brother-in-law over beers in August, was that he could no longer drive past that lot and look at that small hill without feeling something he didn't know how to feel. He had been wrong about a woman. He'd been wrong in the specific way that men of a certain age and a certain income bracket are often wrong about older women who don't explain themselves. He'd watched her dig, and he'd laughed, and he'd called her a name. And she had, in the end, been warmer than him when it mattered. He didn't want to live at the end of her street anymore. Picture one more thing before we go. It's February 10th, 2024, 3 a.m., the worst hour of the worst night of the blizzard. -28 outside, wind at 40 miles per hour, 7 families on Larchmont Drive, either gone to a shelter or shivering under every blanket they own. 61-year-old Ingrid Vahanian, with the half-shaved silver head and the long braid and the 2 different colored eyes, is asleep in her bed. Her Jotool stove has a single pine log smoldering in it. Her soil probe reads 51. Her air temperature reads 68. Her grandmother's icon is on the wall. Her notebook is open on the small table by the stove, and the last entry, written earlier that night in her narrow handwriting in black ink, says, "Outside, -28. Inside, 68. Dirt, 51. Everything is holding. 4 feet of Montana earth sits on top of her, pressing down with a weight of 48 tons, holding in the warmth her grandmother's root cellar in Urumri held the same way in 1967. The physics hasn't changed since then, or since the Neolithic. The dirt is the oldest battery on the planet. She didn't invent it. She didn't discover it. She just, in a way that Dale Brennan, for all his committees and complaints and heating oil, had never learned how to do, bothered to read the pamphlet. And she plugged in. Outside, above her roof, the snow was melting in a small circle about 3 feet across, the only warm spot on a frozen street. A little signal rising up through the dirt, saying something the dog would be the first to understand.